This conference will now be recorded.
All right. So, Jackie, thank you for the introduction. This is Chad Albrecht speaking. I'm going to give a little bit of background on ZS and our sales compensation area. We have recently done a global sales compensation study that we're going to be digging into, and also providing some background and some information on what we see globally in the marketplace, in addition to the study that I mentioned that was just completed in August. But before we get to that, ZS is a sales and marketing consulting firm. We really focus on helping companies grow. We were started about 35 years ago by a couple of Kellogg professors, which is the business school at Northwestern. We have grown since then significantly. We have 23 offices globally. You can see the location on the lower left. We've grown to over 6,000 consultants, and we help our clients in all manner of growth, whether that be go-to-market strategy, market research, sales force structure, and of course, sales compensation design and the technology to support that. So as we move to the next slide, just a little bit of background about our global sales compensation practice. You all are sales comp professionals, so you know the importance of sales compensation. It's probably not too surprising to you that it is our largest practice area within the 6,000 people at ZS. It is our single largest practice area, so we do a lot of it. Some of the detailed facts about our practice area. So we've delivered more than 1,500 compensation engagements. In any given year, we have more than 300 people working on compensation related projects, including 150 projects last year alone. We have a platform that supports over 100,000 salespeople and $2 billion in payouts annually. It's called Javelin, and it's in place in 90 countries. And we design plans for 50,000 salespeople annually. So this is meant to give you a little bit of background as to where we're coming from. So we do work with our clients globally. We see the trends globally. In addition to the background of our practice areas, we have written collectively 3 books. The top one was written by our founders about a decade ago. It's a very comprehensive look at sales force incentive compensation. As Jackie mentioned in the intro, I, along with some colleagues, wrote a couple books over the last couple of years. One is called The Future of Sales Compensation. The second is called Sales Compensation Solutions. So that's a bit about our practice area and where we're coming from. We're very excited to deliver some of the results from our very recent global sales compensation survey. So with that, I'll turn it over to Liz to give some of the background.
Great. So I'm going to skip through a few of these slides since we've already done an introduction, and jump right into this study that Chad had spoken about earlier. So where this came from is we saw through our interactions that there was this increased interest in globalization across the many companies that we've worked with. And so what we wanted to understand is where different companies and different industries were when it comes to the journey towards globalization. So what have they done so far, and then where do they see themselves going in the future? And so what we have today are a summary of some of these trends that we found and some insights across different pieces of that journey when it comes to governance, guidelines, and overall strategy. A little detail on this study. So we spoke with about 35 companies, so sales leaders from those companies, and we spoke across industries, so high tech, professional services, pharmaceutical, med devices were just some of the industries that we touched on. And what you'll see in the future slides is a summary across these different industries, but also some highlights within the industry where we had a large enough sample size to show some trends. Talking about some of the things that we touched on within the study, the first group of questions were centered around how many companies actually have this sales role across the globe, so one common sales role, and then how many of them are also designing a plan globally. Where that wasn't the case, then we dove a little bit deeper into how many companies have guidelines or different types of governance for the different regions and local countries. Talked a little bit about contests and SPIFs, so how many of those are being done at a global level versus the local level, and then similarly talking about the administration of the plan and how that was done, whether it was globally or locally as well. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Chad. He's going to touch on a little bit on the governance, roles, and guidelines findings from the study.
Terrific. Yeah, so in this section, so one of the things, it depends on the industry, but one of the things that we have seen in some industries is companies are actually trying to globalize their roles or at a minimum globalize their guidelines and the governance process. So let me start with the idea of a global sales role. So what we mean when we say this is that literally if I have an account executive role, I have a single role description, and that role description applies to that role title everywhere throughout the globe. So we first wanted to understand, are your roles the same? Because if they are, of course, it's much easier to globalize a sales compensation plan when a single role is doing the same thing throughout the globe. And what we found is between a third and half of companies across industries have global definition of roles. So again, a common definition, a common roles globally. Probably not too surprising to most of you on the phone, high tech leads the way. 83% of companies have designed roles that they intend to or use globally. Now, why would high tech lead the way? Primarily because they are global companies selling to global clients. And there's not a lot of regulations. So if I am a giant Silicon Valley tech company or a tech company here in the West Loop in Chicago, by and large, I am selling a single platform to a global company, and they are going to use it in the same way globally, whether it be an email or a jabbering platform or whatever the platform is. They tend to use the technology in the same way globally. So not surprisingly, the high-tech companies have led the way with saying, look, a particular role is the same regardless of where you're at in the world. And as we'll see later, that also tends to make them more likely to use a common global plan design. Now, what are some of the exceptions that cause companies not to have global sales roles? One is it could be local dynamics. So, for example, in some countries, your product may be a very mature product with single-digit growth, but it might be a high-growth product in China, for instance. That may require different sales roles. It may just be in different points in its life cycle, depending on where you are in the globe. Geography size. So for the U.S. is obviously one of the largest markets in the world. You might be able to have roles where you have an account owner and then you have lots of subspecialties that support the account owner based on, again, sticking with the high-tech example, the type of software we're talking about. You may not be able to do that in China or other places where you really need a single person to cover an entire geography. Cultural norms as well. So maybe you want to go to a single role, very individualized role, but you find that in Japan they are much more team-oriented, and so the role may have to look different. And finally, regulations was probably the primary reason companies did not go to a single global sales role, because every country is regulated differently. So this is definitely true in the pharmaceutical industry, or healthcare in general, I should say. It's true in financial services as well. There tends to be a very localized set of regulations, so trying to superimpose a global role on top of that just doesn't work. So if we go to the next slide and take a look at, okay, how does that translate into global plan design? So for those companies, as you recall, it's only 41% of companies that do have a global role, but of those companies, almost 2/3 actually implement identical sales compensation plans globally. And once again, that is led by high tech. So 2/3 of high tech companies have global roles, and they also have a global plan design for that role, and that includes a global pay mix. So that is one area that used to really be country determined, that even if you had a common plan design, they would always allow the local countries to determine the pay mix. That is something we've seen change in the last decade. We have seen more and more tech companies say that, for example, if I have a hunter role and it's a 60-40 mix in the US, we are going to enforce that it's a 60-40 mix globally. That is definitely a new development over the last decade. And of course, to do that really relies on the commonality of the role. So it really does require a global role, so that because if I'm not asking them to do the same thing, it's kind of hard to put them on a common global incentive plan. So Liz, I've been talking a lot. I don't know if there's anything you have to add on the pharma side. I know you do a lot of work in that space. Anything you would note on this slide before we go to the next page?
Yeah, I think the kind of the opposite from the high tech side is we often don't see at all that common sales role globally when it comes to pharma. And I think it's that one point that Chad had mentioned when it comes to the local dynamics, but also the regulation. So without having a common sales role, we often don't see common plan design either on the pharmaceutical.
Yeah, thank you for that. And then on the next slide, so if you don't have common global plans, so one of the questions we asked was, do you at least use global comp guidelines? So I may not have an identical plan for for the same role globally, but do I at least have some set of guidelines? And the vast majority do. So they want to make sure that even if I can't enforce a global plan design, that I'm enforcing best practice throughout. So yes, we are going to give you local country, full authority on your sales compensation plan, but some of the most common global guiding principles we saw were a maximum number of metrics. So we usually say 3 is best practice. Some companies go up to 4, but there's the maximum number of metrics and the minimum weight you can have on a metric. Those are 2 very common global guiding principles that we see where common global plans are not in place. Whether you can have an MBO in the plan. An MBO stands for Management by Objectives. They tend to be more subjective measures, and so a lot of companies in their global guidelines will have requirements or guidelines on A, whether you can have them, and B, if you do, there's often a maximum weight, perhaps 20% with that MBO. One of the other guiding principles we see is the maximum upside. So if we're going to, let's say we can earn $20,000 as our target incentive, a common global guiding principle is to limit the max upside. So in that example I gave, so nobody's allowed to earn over 80,000 because that's 4 times the target incentive. We want to limit on the upside so that people aren't earning rampantly. And then the last element that we commonly see from a sales comp guideline standpoint is the performance period and the payout frequency. So for example, if I set an annual financial budget, maybe I'm going to tell every country you have to set an annual quota for your salespeople. You have to have an annual sales incentive plan, and you need to pay them out either based on the pay mix or you need to pay them out monthly, quarterly, whatever the case may be. In addition to some of those global guiding principles, about half of the companies that we talked with required global approval of the final plan to ensure compliance with global guidelines, meaning even though we put those guiding principles out there, does not mean that we can actually, that people are going to follow it. We have to require, we have to take a final look at it. And Liz, maybe you can comment a bit on pharma companies and how they use global guidelines.
Yeah, so I think it's very similar to what Chad just mentioned, but we're seeing that quite often pharma companies are implementing these global guidelines. So 70% of pharma companies say they do have guidelines for their either global or regional or local level. And I think this is a trend that we've seen over the past couple of years and expect to see as in the future, over the coming few years, that there is a shift of more companies using these global guidelines to kind of monitor or regulate somewhat the plan within the regional or local levels.
Okay, great. Thanks, Liz. If we go to the next page on the governance model, so we're digging at one step, getting one step lower with the governance model. What kinds of issues would a governance committee cover? So a governance committee is often a very multidisciplinary group of folks that consists of often HR or comp within HR, finance, sales operations, if you're large enough to have a sales operations group. And it often goes across geographies and across business units. And of course, the goal is we want to make sure everybody's treated in a fair and consistent way globally. So what kinds of things are often asked of a governance committee? So one is maybe quota relief. So maybe, so in the U.S., for example, Hurricane Harvey or Hurricane Katrina, going back 13 years now, those were things that governance committees got together and they said, we want to treat all business units the same. So if we're going to guarantee pay for our Houston salespeople, for instance, during the months that they were impacted by Hurricane Harvey, we want to make sure that we're consistent and fair. That's just one example. Another example is bluebirds or windfalls or very large sales that were not expected at the beginning of the year. They often require very senior levels of management to get involved because of their pure size. Sometimes those need to be looked at. So some threshold beyond which, so for example, if you have a single deal that covers more than 100% of your quota just on a single deal, that might be the threshold at which it goes to a governance committee. The other thing they often look at is extreme attainment or extreme payout. So anything over a certain dollar amount, they look at and say, why did this happen? How did this happen? Did this person really earn it? And they try to be consistent globally in how they treat people. So along with that responsibility of governance, it's often this same committee or a subset of the committee that's monitoring the plan. So we would put that under governance as well. So they're looking to see on a regular basis, quarterly at minimum, because that lines up with most public companies' earnings delivery. Often they do it monthly if they have a global SPM system that allows them to look at things monthly. They often do so. And some things they look at, they update their accrual estimates. How much are we going to pay? Or do we think we're going to pay based on what we know at the end of the first quarter through the end of the year? Do we need to update anything on our financials, for example? They also want to gauge plan performance. How many people do we have at quota thus far? How are we, do we only have, let's say, 30% of our people at quota, and do we need to make a change, a mid-period change, or is that something that we expected because of the way we set up the quotas? So that's a little bit of an overview of how companies set up their global roles, set up their sales comp guidelines, set up a global sales compensation plan to the extent they do, and also govern their sales compensation plan. So I'm going to turn it over to Liz. She's going to talk about other reward programs, but Liz, if you also want to add anything about how pharma handles governance on the back end of that last slide, you're welcome to talk about that as well.
Great, thanks, Chad. Yeah, just going a little bit back to that last slide, as noted here, less than half at this point in time, we're handling governance by either a global or regional team. I think as time goes on and there's more of this shift towards globalization, that number might increase, but currently it's not as common as some other industries. So talking a little bit about reward programs, there's two aspects to this that our study focused on. And the first was the annual recognition program. And so we wanted to understand how many of the companies had a single global program across all the countries and regions. And what we found is about 40% of them do. But what we mean by that is the criteria for inclusion into this program. The winners of the program are still defined almost exclusively across all of the companies that we spoke to at a more local level, so either at the country level or the region level. So while the metric or criteria might be similar for many of these companies, winners are still determined at a lower level. When thinking about the reward itself, trips are often a common reward for this program, and most of the time it's local. Some companies, I think only a couple that we spoke to, had a single global trip where all the countries went to one single location. However, the winners, again, still determined at that local level. So determined at the local level, but then sent on a global trip.
Yeah, the one example, Zebra Technologies participated on the head of sales comp for Zebra. She and I co-spoke at a recent conference, and she was one of the companies that does have a single global trip to somewhere in Southeast Asia. And they're looking at whether they localize it more. I mean, it sounds exotic, it sounds great, but taking it, a day to get there, a day to recover, and then the same thing on the back end, it can be exhausting. And so the majority of companies have local trips, really just for logistics more than anything else.
Thanks for that, Chad. And then just talking a little bit back on the guidelines that Chad had mentioned earlier, most companies are providing guidelines when it comes to the recognition program as well. So regarding the value or the percent of winners across that local level. Looking at SPIFs or contests, we saw very few companies actually are hosting a contest or organizing a contest globally. And this makes sense if you think about contests and SPIFs tend to be shorter term in nature, tend to be focused on a very specific initiative. Those initiatives will generally be more local. And so it kind of makes sense that not many companies are hosting these global contests. However, there are still a little bit under 20% that are doing it. Instead, most companies are taking different approaches, and some allow the local level to be completely autonomous, run their contests as they see fit. In other cases, they are either allocating budget, approving the contests, or asking for some type of ROI assessment from the local level to understand what the return would be for those contests. So not really organizing them, but sometimes involved in the approval of those contests. Anything you'd like to add there, Chad?
No, I don't think so. I think it's, these are so company and product specific, and what are we trying to do in our local market? And I was thinking back to a comment I made earlier about the difference. Not every product is in the same position in its life cycle. And so given that SPIFs are supposed to be these short-term, really focused events, it really does make sense that these would be much more localized. Sometimes they require approval to make sure people aren't just giving money away, but it does make sense for a 1 month short-term incentive that these really need to be very focused on what we're trying to do locally. So this outcome makes sense based on what I've seen.
So moving on to the next section, which we focused on, was the ongoing administration of the plan, and at what level that was performed across the many companies. So the first focus area was kind of the presence of this sales performance system, sales performance management system, and we did find that many companies are using this system in one way, or a performance system in one way or another. There are some that are using the SPM system globally, and in those cases, they are using the same tool for all their affiliates and regions globally. So about 60% of them, of companies that are using them globally, are using the same tool. And also, the majority of them do have a centralized team that's running the administration on an ongoing basis. So for those companies that do have this global SPM, almost all of them, 70% of them, are running the admin for all the countries. There are, about 27% of the companies do intend to implement a uniform system in the future. So that's something that I think we'll see that number growing as time goes on as well. And then one thing on the pharma side, while all of the companies have a system in place for at least one of their countries, we did see that only 50% of them have an SPM for all or most of their countries. So a lot of pharma companies still have individual countries running their incentive compensation plans outside of a system, a formal SPM system.
Yeah, part of this, the 100% with high tech, I think companies want to know where their incentive money is going. And in some markets, particularly in Asia, it's very manual. It's done on spreadsheets. They want some way to be able to flag any issues and really know and understand exactly what money is being paid out in incentives. So there's really a desire to put more and more countries on a common platform if they can. That way the CFO or whomever's in charge of the sales comp expense can go to a single place and look and see globally, what am I paying out in incentives? Is there any anomaly? Is there any potential fraud? Because as a CFO, I now have to sign off on our financial reporting statements that everything is true and accurate and there's no fraud involved. And that is part of the reason more and more companies want these global systems that a single person can look and quickly see globally that everything is in order financially and that there isn't anything bad going on in any particular geography.
Great. And then as Chad mentioned, there are companies that aren't using a formal SPM system. And in those cases, they tend to be either Excel or some type of homegrown tool that they're using. And for those that aren't using this type of system, the administration of the sales compensation plans tend to be more at a local level. So 75% of those companies are doing admin at the more local level. Which makes sense because you wouldn't expect a lot of companies to be able to handle, a global sales compensation program across the many countries with the many data inputs through an Excel. You would want some type of formal system in place there.
Yeah, and some of the markets, not to pick on Asia, but those are often the markets where you see people use the justification. Look, I can hire somebody or two people. At a much lower rate than it's going to cost me to license the software. And so that's often the justification. There are, of course, lots of well-known issues with manual calculations. That's probably another topic for another webinar. But there are many issues with that, but that's often the argument that you get rather than trying to license SPM globally. In certain markets, they would rather just put bodies on it, and that has its own set of issues.
Great. So that's the end of the study results. What we wanted to kind of focus on now is, as you're thinking about your companies and this journey on globalizing the compensation plan or program, what are some of the things that need to be considered? So what factors should be top of mind? And I think the first one we touched on a few times is this these cultural differences across the different regions or the countries. So we have a slide actually after this that will touch a little bit on cultural differences as well. But there are different plan designs and different components that are considered based on historical cultural differences. Additionally, there's, as Chad had mentioned earlier, the product might be in a different life cycle stage depending on the country. So there might be different needs, different initiatives, or a different strategy for those products in Asia versus Europe. And so those differences are sometimes manifesting themselves through different IC plans or contests, BIFs, things like that. There are some legal considerations that should be considered when globalizing the plan. So one example is the Germany Workers' Council, which has a very strong say in employees' compensation, and so they have to be often involved in when compensation plans are changing. There are other different considerations across the different markets that may need to be considered that are like that. We spoke a bit about the SPM systems, so just considering what type of system would help facilitate this globalization of the programs, making sure that the systems and processes in place support a global program and administration. And then also just noting, what data is available, how it comes through, how often it comes through, what privacy issues may need to be considered with that data, because it will be different based on the different markets, and being able to be flexible to handle the different markets would be critical as we think about this globalization of the program. And so, as I mentioned, there's a few considerations when it comes to different cultures and different markets. This study is separate than the one we discussed earlier, but it was a few studies we've done in the pharma industry particularly, but we do think that generally it's reflective of some trends we're seeing in the non-pharma industry as well. And it just highlights some of those cultural differences. So when we think about the variable pay versus salary, we often see that Japan tends to be a little bit more conservative, as well as some countries in the EU, when compared to India, for example, that puts a lot more money at stake or money towards that variable piece of the pay. Thinking about plan design, team components or national components are more important in Japan and some areas in Europe, and versus, let's say, MBOs, which are gaining popularity in both Europe and the US. So those are just some considerations on when plan designs might need to be different based on the market. And then also just generally use of other award systems. So we see contests are very, very popular in the United States for pharma, but not nearly as popular in EU. So that might be one thing to consider as we're moving towards globalizing the program. Chad, any insights from a non-pharma perspective that you can bring in here?
Yeah, I think directionally, other industries are similar. U.S. tends to be one of the more highly leveraged. We do see high leverage in India as well. I think the last survey I saw, Dardanelle used to do a survey of all industries, and the last one was a while ago, but it showed that across all industries, people would have about 40% of their pay at risk as opposed to 25% for pharma. But it does tend to be slightly less in Europe and Japan, with the exception of some of those high-tech industries I mentioned earlier, which indeed have gone with global variable pay mix guidelines. They've even went to the works councils, as you pointed out, in Germany and France and elsewhere, and said this is a business prerogative that we have everybody on the same plan globally, and they were able to get it approved. I was actually not optimistic when we took it to the works councils, but we were able to get it approved. But I think a lot of the other things that you have listed here also apply outside of the pharmaceutical industry as well. I think maybe just one last comment on the MBOs. I think people like the flexibility of MBOs. They get frustrated by the lack of differentiation in payout. So I think if they add MBOs, they are typically for more of the team-oriented sell, and we want to make sure that they are not just free money. That's not just kind of a supplemental salary. There's no differentiation. We go to a heck of a lot of work to set the MBOs and evaluate the MBOs and calculate payouts, and then everybody gets largely the same thing. So that is something that while we're seeing an increase in MBOs, we're also seeing an increase in mandated discipline in how those MBOs are administered, and the challenge, the difficulty of the goals to make sure that they're actually challenging and differentiating. Otherwise, it's just a lot of pain for no real gain. But otherwise, I think what I've seen is aligned with what you have on the page.
Great. So with that, I think we're opening it up for questions or comments from the audience.
Okay, the lines are now open.
Anybody have a question either on the study results that we displayed, or maybe a specific question that you are struggling with from a global standpoint? Maybe while we're waiting for questions, I'll throw in one tidbit that I've seen. I have seen more what we call COE, Centers of Excellence, that involve global members. So I have seen, even for companies that don't have global comp plans or global roles, they are developing a global center of excellence that includes design experts in each of the geographies or regions of the world. So they'll have a North America sales comp expert, and they'll have a South America or Latin America sales comp expert, and then a European and Asia, and perhaps some others as well. But they get together on a quarterly basis to make sure that they are all following best practice, to learn from one another. What have you seen? What have you tried? So we've definitely seen an increase in collaboration globally as well. Jackie, any questions that you've seen come in?
No, I have not. All the lines are now open, so they can, any attending that would like to ask a question can just speak up.
Okay. And if not, any final comments from my colleague Jean-Francois, also known as JF, or Liz? Any final comments that you would offer on the globalization of sales comp?
Yeah, I guess from my side, just I think that it is something that a lot of companies are interested in and moving towards, and I think there's a lot of questions still around how do you get there, because it is a bigger journey. So I think just making sure that we're kind of considering all the different aspects, and also the change management part of it, because it could be a big change for the different countries who are used to kind of running things on their own. So that's another key part that I don't think we touched on here, but to consider.
I think it's a great point. The change management is at least as important as the change itself, because so often, if it's the home office dictating, regardless of where the home office is, the other countries tend not to respond well to that. That it's become an imperial dictatorship, that they're now imposing whatever you think is the right way on me, and it is a very, very delicate change management situation. So I think that is a great call out. If you do decide to globalize your plans and or roles, do not ignore the extent of change management required. That's going to require at least as much time and planning as the plan design itself. So last call for questions. Otherwise, we'll give you 15 minutes back to your day.
Hi, my name is Karen Wojcik. Great presentation, Chad and Liz and Jean-Francois. It really kind of reinforced a situation that I was involved in a few years ago with a client who wanted to have a more globalized plan. I think the biggest challenge, and you addressed it, but I wondered if you have any additional comments on having the cost involved of having a single system and having all, because all of the information was in local financial systems, they wasn't even always being captured in the same way. What are the challenges that an organization might face in terms of, well, I know what the challenges are, but what kind of solutions or what kind of recommendations have you made in those kinds of situations?
Yeah, so just to repeat your question, I'll probably have my colleagues answer it since they're very experienced on the operational side, but it sounds like you've been trying to look at how do we justify the cost in some cases of the expense of putting it in all of these markets globally. Does that capture the essence of the question?
Yeah, but I think it also relates to your comment earlier about change management, because some of the and some of the regions were capturing. I mean, they were it was the same kind of product and market, but the way that they were going about it meant that they were the information that they were rewarding and paying incentive on was sometimes different. And so, they weren't gathering the same kind of information region to region or country to country.
Yeah, and maybe last question, what industry are you in, if I may ask?
It was agricultural sales, global agricultural sales.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll take the answer, Chad, on this one. So it's a really good observation. As you mentioned, it's one of the main driver of globalization in incentive platform to try to consolidate all of the information, because the main challenge that you have when you don't have a global SPM is you are not able to capture the information, you're not able to validate your plan, you're not able to understand what's happening, and you really lack the transparency into the effect. So what we've seen some company doing, so if they were not able to basically establish a global SPM platform, as part of their governance process, they would basically define specific templates for inputs that they were receiving from the different countries. And then they would receive these at every plan change and basically aggregate them and review them. So that was part of their governance and part of their global guideline to set up those templates. So it's kind of a little bit of an ad hoc way to solve it, but it has somewhat worked. But definitely it's one of the main reasons companies are contemplating to expanding SPM now to be able to have more transparency.
And maybe one final comment or one additional comment is one of the things for companies that do globalize their sales comp plan, they get input from all corners of the earth before they design it. So they interview or survey all of the countries or all of the groups that would be impacted by it. And oftentimes, even the ones that say they have a global plan, so a very common feature in the high-tech world, for instance, is there'll be a 15 or 20% carve out that are essentially MBOs that allow the local market to do whatever they want. And so that is often a kind of a peace offering, if you will, to the local markets to say, yes, we need commonality, but we realize we don't want to impose everything we want onto you. So we're going to give you 20% to give you it's kind of a local MBOs or challenges, whatever it's called, to allow you in your local market to drive what you think is right. So those are a couple of other tips as a way that to try and get buy-in from local countries.
Thanks for those answers, both of you, because we did do a lot of interviews with country managers and sales managers, and those who are doing the administration and the finance as well. And we did move in that direction, Jean-Francois, of doing of doing some global templates, simply because they came quickly to realize that they did not have. They wanted to move. They wanted to change this overnight, and they quickly realized with our assistance that they really needed to have this global system. They needed to have a global, either a financial system or the sales performance system. And so we moved in the direction of trying to gather as much information as possible and the templates. So thank you again for kind of validating that process.
No
Sounds like you
problem.
did it right. Thanks for the question. Any other final questions from folks on the phone? All right. And Jackie, unless you've seen other questions come in that we have not seen, perhaps we'll end it there.
Okay, so I would like to, on behalf of CCA, we'd like to thank our presenters, Chad, JF, and Liz.
Thank you for having us. We really enjoyed it.
We'd also like to thank our sponsors for their continued support of CCA. You'll find a complete list of all of our sponsors on our website. We'd also like to remind you to complete the evaluation forms that will be sent to you electronically this afternoon. These evaluation forms are important as our program committee does use them for future program development. Our next CCA program is Excel Skills for Compensation Professionals on February 20th and 21st at the Willis Tower, Watson. We are very proud to partner with World at Work to deliver this course to the Chicago compensation community. You can find all the details of our CCA upcoming events on our website at www.chicagocompensation.org. And here at CCA, we would like to thank you once again for attending and have a great day.